In the previous lesson on the working memory system, we drew a box up here in the frontal cortex, and we said the working memory system is this short-term sort of information manipulation system in the brain, similar to the RAM of a computer. We had the frontal cortex systems providing a temporary workspace. That's obviously a sort of a metaphor for information provided by other brain areas. Information in the workspace can be broadcast to other brain regions to guide further processing. So the brain is, certain brain regions are going to feed information up into the working memory system, and then the working memory system can communicate back with other brain systems to influence future processing. And we ended with a kind of a puzzle. How is it that a single brain cell might show sustained activity over the course of seconds when the electrical activity of a single brain cell is a fraction of a second? Let's remind ourselves how these brain cells operate. Here we have the cell body of one brain cell, and it might be excited by its inputs to generate an electrical signal called the action potential that races down the axon, gets to the terminal, neurotransmitters are released. Those transmitters open up channels on the target cell, little ions go into the cell, creating a little electrical signal here, and if enough signals enter the cell, then this cell will generate an output response, its own electrical signal. So we have the presynaptic neuron, we have the synapse, is the junction between two brain cells, and then we have the postsynaptic neuron. So if you think about the time it takes for an electrical signal to race down and then transmitters and the target cell response, this is fractions of a second. Yet working memory is a phenomenon that lasts on the order of seconds. We can keep things in mind for seconds. So it can't be that the working memory system is constituted by two brain cells that are communicating. And neither could it be four brain cells hooked up in a chain. So you see, we have a kind of a puzzle here. Because after all, we want to try to understand working memory in terms of brain cells. So the duration of the neural activity must match the duration of working memory. If we're really going to get a handle of the brain basis, the cellular basis of working memory, we have to find some arrangement of brain cells that can sustain activity for the length of time that we typically keep things in working memory. So if it's not chains, what could it be? What about this? Loops of neurons. Notice then, this neuron will activate this neuron, and this neuron will electrically excite this neuron and this one, and it'll go round and around and around. So that if we were recording, back to that experiment here, if we were recording from one brain cell and we showed sustained activity, well, that would be explained by a loop of neural activity. So if we were just recording from this neuron here, we would sort of record consistent sustained activity because it kept being activated in this circular pattern of neural connections. So now let's sketch out how the working memory system might work in terms of loops of neural activity. So here we have our brain. We have our working memory box in the frontal cortex here. Whatever's in the box will be the contents of working memory. And here in the back part of the brain, we have two icons, a cat and a tree with the kind of loops of neurons here. Now this will be our icon for either those populations of cells that are activated by the visual perception of a cat or the memory of a cat. And for the tree, likewise, those populations of cells that are activated by the perception of a tree and or the memory of a tree. So the idea then is populations of neurons that respond to cats and trees are in the visual system. The visual system has a certain pattern of activity when a cat or a tree is present. And these neurons are activated when the appropriate visual stimulus is seen. So let's take a look here. In this situation, here we have the person, here's the retina, and they're currently looking at the tree. Now, the optic nerve sends electrical signals to the thalamus. There's a synapse in the thalamus. Cells in the thalamus send axons up to visual cortex. Electrical signals race up to the visual cortex, and there's lots of visual processing going on in the back of the brain here. And the idea is that if the person is looking at the tree, there's a certain set of cells that are responding to the tree stimulus. And their activity then becomes part of a loop of neural activity. And that then allows the tree to enter into our conscious awareness. We would say the tree then would be the content of our working memory. So working memory is thought to be based on loops of neural activity, with frontal cortex regions communicating with other brain regions that provide the contents of working memory. The entire system is a workspace for processing information from many other brain regions. The results of such processing can be broadcast back to widespread regions of the brain. So we want to think of this working memory system as a workspace. And one of the things that enters into this workspace is what we're currently perceiving. Now, if we have seen the tree before and have a memory of it, the activation of the memory constitutes recognition of the tree. The current pattern of visual activity matches the stored representation of the tree. So if this were a tree in our front yard and we've seen it many times, we have a memory of what our front yard tree looks like. So now this icon would represent that memory. And when we see our front yard tree again, the current pattern of visual activity is going to sort of reactivate that stored memory, and we experience that as a recognition. We've identified our front yard tree. But nevertheless, we become conscious of our tree when these loops of neural activity get established with the working memory system. Now, tree and cat memories are populations of neurons that selectively respond to those cats and trees. Well, how did they get there? Well, they were tuned by visual experience and now represent the memories of what cats and trees look like, although not currently activated. So if we're not looking at a cat or the tree in the front yard, then we have memories of what our cat looks like and what the front yard tree looks like, but they're just not currently activated. So notice our working memory box is empty here. We're not currently thinking about or seeing our cat or the front yard tree. And this tuning process of establishing visual memories for things, of course, would involve synaptic plasticity. So some cells in the visual pathway will come to selectively respond to our cat or the tree in the front yard because synapses have increased in strength among certain sets of cells that constitute the memory of those two things. Now in this picture, notice something has changed. The person has shifted their gaze to see the cat. A shift of attention changes the contents of working memory. Since the tree cells are no longer participating in loops of activity, the subject loses visual awareness of the tree. Now the cat is the content of working memory and is consciously perceived. Working memory and consciousness are closely related phenomena. Now consider the following situation. There is no cat in your immediate environment, so your cat is not around, but somebody asks you to imagine your cat. The cue to imagine your cat triggers a reactivation of the cat memory cells, which establish loops of electrical activity, thus generating a visual image in working memory. This is an example of retrieving a memory. So again, if we know our cat, we have a memory of our cat, that memory is not activated unless we're sort of seeing the cat or thinking about the cat. And one way to reactivate that memory is to get a cue like imagine your cat. Here then, the cue is going to reactivate the memory of our cat, set up loops of neural activity, and then we're going to have a visual image. Now a lot of people report that the visual image of the cat is not as vivid as the actual perception of a cat, but nevertheless we can have an image of a cat even though our cat is not present. So working memory provides a workspace for activated long-term memories, which can trigger the retrieval of related information. If I was just imagining my cat, I might also start to think about other things associated with my cat. And we'll see in another lesson that this is one of the main functions of the working memory system as a system that helps search for relevant, related information to help guide behavior. So if I'm currently imagining my cat, I'm likely to have other cat thoughts that are related to my cat. So to go back to the original puzzle, you'll recall that in the single-cell recording experiments, they found cells that were persistently active for the duration of the sort of the working memory time frame, time 2 here, where the animal was maintaining the location of a stimulus that has disappeared. And so that became a puzzle. How could we get that sustained activity? And our solution was loops of neurons. So when they were recording this sustained activity, the idea is they were recording from a cell in the frontal cortex, but that cell was being repeatedly activated due to loops of neural activity. So, with our understanding of working memory as loops of neural activity, we can understand the following. Perception. What is it? Patterns of brain cells activated by the visual stimulus set up loops of electrical activity with cells in the working memory system. Recognition. What do we mean by that? The current pattern of visual activity matches a stored memory, and so then we identify the object as something we have seen before. And what about visual imagery? That would be the internal reactivation of a stored memory such that loops of electrical activity produce an image of the object. And for most people, the experience is not as vivid as genuine perception. Nevertheless, the idea is in all these cases we have loops of neural activity that provide the contents to working memory, and when those loops stop, then the contents disappear.